So I'm coming down from having a cold. I'm almost done. So I'm hoping that I can get through this without coughing and blowing my nose too much. So needless to say, after in the foyer, no handshaking for your sake. But the man Jesus, 2,000 years ago, human being, he looked at his followers and he looked them in the eyes and he said those words that Kent just read. He said to them, he said, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." He said, "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and I am humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." And today, centuries later, because of the celebration that we had last month of Easter, Jesus is alive and is still speaking to us today. And I believe that he is speaking that to us today, collectively, as a community and as individuals. Jesus would say to us, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened and carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." This scripture, I believe it is so powerful that I just want to take it step by step and explore it kind of phrase by phrase together. That first part where Jesus says, "Come to me." Jesus says, "Come to me." This is an invitation. It's an invitation to discipleship, to following Jesus. We know the 12 disciples, who were later called the 12 apostles, and that a disciple is a follower. A disciple is a learner. And Jesus was taking this time and he was talking to his followers. And we all here are followers of Jesus if we've accepted the invitation to come to me, to come to Jesus. I can't help but wonder when Jesus said, "Come to me," when he first started that, if the disciples, Peter and Andrew and James and John, if they were thinking back, I wonder if they remembered that day when Jesus was walking along the shore of the Sea of Galilee and they were fishing. And he looked over at them and he said, "Come, follow me." An invitation that they accepted, an invitation to discipleship, an invitation to following Jesus, to following the way of Jesus. "Come to me, all you who are weary and carrying heavy burdens." If you're worn out this morning or in this season of your life, and I know a lot of us are, if you're tired, you might be at the end of your rope, or maybe you're just giving so much, or maybe you're giving a lot to your family right now, or to your community, or maybe to work. You're just using energy that you don't really have, or you're working on borrowed energy. It's like you're running on fumes. You might be weary. You might be worn out. You just might be tired. Jesus says this morning to you, "Come to me." Jesus extends his invitation to us that he will give us rest. "Come to me, all you who are weary and carrying heavy burdens." Maybe you feel weary, but maybe you don't feel too weary, but maybe you feel like you're carrying a heavy burden. Like the weight of the world just bears down on your shoulders. Yeah. You know what I'm talking about. You feel that way sometimes. I mean, not all of us do. And we all have different seasons of our lives where we feel that way. And some of us have a higher propensity to be able to carry burdens. Or maybe you just haven't learned, how to deal with your stress very well. You carry it around. Maybe you carry a stress up here. When you're carrying heavy burdens and you're stressed out, maybe you get headaches. Or maybe you carry it back here in the back of your neck, and now it's tight, right? Or if you're like me, maybe you carry your stress in your lower back. That's where I carry it. It's the anxiety, right? The things of the world, the cares of the world, the things that weigh us down, the pressures of daily life, the minutia of the day to day. But if you're carrying heavy burdens this morning, my word to you is that you really don't have to do that. I know that sometimes that we think that we do, we think that we have to carry that, but Jesus' words spoken to us this morning is that we don't have to do that. You don't have to carry those heavy burdens. If you're weary, you can find rest in Jesus. If you're carrying these heavy burdens, Jesus promises to you that you will find rest. We're not meant to carry this heavy load. We're not designed to carry it. God is. And so we take our burdens and we lay them down before God. And He will give us rest because of the next part in this verse. It says, "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart." Take my yoke upon you. We all know what a yoke is. Not an egg yolk. Maybe you had an egg yolk for breakfast this morning. Not that kind of yolk, but a yoke, it's a farming tool where you have like two animals and they're linked together, like two oxen, and maybe they're pulling a plow, right? And they're linked together by this harness, this wooden thing that goes around their heads and their necks, and it keeps them in sync. It keeps them going together. It keeps them going at the same speed. That's what a yoke is. It keeps them in sync. But what keeps you in sync? You know, or what's your yoke? What are you attached to this morning? What is it that's got you locked in? I mean, we all have to be locked into something. I remember when I first read this scripture years ago, I thought to myself, well, you know, I don't really want a yoke. I want to be free. You know, Jesus says, "Take my yoke upon you." I don't want that. I want to be free. But if we follow the metaphor that Jesus is giving, is that we got to be yoked to something. Does anybody remember the Bob Dylan song from the 1980s? You gotta have to serve somebody. Well, it may be the devil or it may be the Lord, but you're gonna have to serve somebody. Anybody remember that? That's not my best Bob Dylan. Okay, we got one. Anybody else? Come on, we got two. But I don't think Bob Dylan necessarily subscribes theologically to that anymore. And neither do I with a lot of things. We've all matured and grown in our faith and in our thinking, right? But what I like about that line is you're going to have to serve somebody, is that you have to be attached to something, right? Something's guiding your life. Something's directing you. So there's an invitation here from Jesus. Come to me. You know? What's going to guide your life? What are you going to be connected to, like the yoke? Who are you going to be connected to? Jesus here paints a picture of us being connected to Him with a yoke. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me. There's a connection between the yoke and the learn from me. Our yoke are the teachings of Jesus. We're learning. But we're not just pupils, we're apprentices. We're not merely thinking about the teachings of Jesus, but we're doing them. We're practitioners. So the yoke of Jesus is not just to study and to learn about the ways of Jesus and the teachings of Jesus, but to do them. So it's not all about being up here. It's about being here too, and being here. It's an embodied faith. So the invitation is to have this guiding your life, the teachings of Jesus, being a learner of Jesus, being a follower of Jesus. And these teachings, they're all summed up in what? The teachings of Jesus, the whole of Scripture are all summed up in what? Remember that story where someone approaches Jesus and says, what's the most important thing? Jesus actually gives them an answer. A lot of times when Jesus is asked a question, he answers it with another question. But here he actually answers. And he says, what's the most important thing? And Jesus says, love the Lord, your God, with all of your heart and all of your soul and all of your strength and all of your mind, everything. All of your being, not just our intellect, but our whole selves. That's the teachings of Jesus. And then Jesus went on to say, and love your neighbor as yourself. Those two, they're intimately connected. You can't separate them. That's the teachings of Jesus, summed up. Love God, love people. And then there's a lot in and around that, too. But if you were to sum it up, that's that. But then if you were to, flesh that out and say, okay, what does that actually mean to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself? What does that mean in our world today, in our particular culture right here? What does it mean to love God in our current culture right here in our current age? Or, for me specifically, wherever you happen to be on the spectrum of being an introvert or an extrovert, or where you land on a personality test like the Myers-Briggs or Enneagram, what does it mean for you to love God with the uniqueness of the personality that you have, that God has made you? It's different. It's different for all of us. It always changes. In as many ways as we are made, there are that many ways to put into practice loving God with all of our heart, mind, soul, and strength, and loving one another. So there's a lot of ways to flesh that out, but summarizing the teachings of Jesus, it's simple. It's to love God, love neighbor. That's the yoke that we put on. That's the thing that you're connected to. That's the one thing that we're connected to. So Jesus says, if you're tired, if you're weary, if you're worn out, if you're on your last leg, if you're at the end of your rope, you got nothing left, you're just bone dry. If you're carrying burdens, heavy burdens in this season of your life, Jesus says, and join me, alongside me, yoked together. Join me, join my way. It's what I call the Jesus way. You might call it Christianity. I like to call it the Jesus way. It's this new way of living in the world, loving God and loving people. It says, take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I'm gentle and humble in heart. Jesus is not a harsh taskmaster, giving us heavy burdens to carry from one place to another. It's gentle. We can trust the way of Jesus. My yoke is easy and my burden is light. Actually, that word easy can better be translated kind. My yoke is kind. It's like when it's around your neck, it's not chafing, It's not like digging into you. You don't resent it. My yoke is kind. It feels good. You're locked into him. But when we sign on to the Jesus way, it's not always easy, is it? If somebody tells you that following God is easy, they're mistaken, or that living a life of service to God is easy. Sometimes it doesn't work that way, right? I think we all know that. But we can do it. We can carry the burden, and the burden is light, and God helps us to carry it. Because Jesus is right there, right alongside us. We're yoked, connected to him, and it's there that we find rest for our souls. And then there's some of us that have a hard time resting, right? For some of us, it's genuinely really hard to find time to rest. One of the hardest jobs in the world, being a mom of young children, it's hard to find actual time in your actual day to get away and to stop and to rest. But Jesus is calling us to find rest also in the secret place, in the quiet place, in the hidden place of our hearts. That's where God helps us to find rest. But it can be hard to be able to step back, to be able to rest, to be able to live that kind of a lifestyle. You know how if you're trying to get something done and You know how you actually get more done if you take some breaks than if you actually try to just plow on through it. Or sometimes we're hurrying or we're in a rush, and you're not grounded and you're just not centered, and it's easy to forget that and you just plow on through. Or even to take a day of rest once a week, like a Sabbath. It's really hard to practice in this day and age for us in our culture. The situation that we find ourselves in. That's a hard thing to do. I mean, don't get me wrong. I don't think that the scriptures say that it's like a rule or something that we have to, have a day of rest. But following Jesus is not about rules. But I do think that it's a healthy thing for us to do. So I encourage us to explore that, the idea of taking a day of rest. I try to practice that. Now I try to practice it. That doesn't always happen, but I try to, because I believe in it. I believe that when you rest, that you're recharged, and then you're better able to give and to serve after you rest. But Jesus gives us rest. Jesus gives us a lifestyle of rest, to be able to rest in Him and to be able to just be, because Jesus' yoke is easy and His burden is light, and you'll find rest for your souls. The great church fathers, you know the church fathers, back in the early days when the church was still young, it was after Jesus, but it was just for the first few hundred years, and the church was still forming, and there were these great theologians, and we look back now, we call them the early church fathers. But there was this one, Augustine, and he said, I love this thing that he said. He said, our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you, God. I just love that, because it really speaks to us, in our culture now. Our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you, God. Restlessness, it's like an epidemic, It's like we always have to be busy, we always have to do, we got to say something, and we got to fill in the space. We don't like silence, we can't stand that. It's difficult to keep still. It's hard for us to handle, but it's so important in our relationship with God to be able to learn to be still. It's the art of being still before God in prayer. To be still before God, to contemplate God's goodness, to meditate. Maybe to meditate on the works of God, to be still, to meditate, to pray. But restlessness is like a sickness that doesn't allow us to do that. And still the call of God is for us to find rest. And so God calls out to each of us, come to me. And it's countercultural. It's countercultural to do that, isn't it? And so often the good news of God is countercultural. Our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you, God. So as I close, I just pray that you would find your rest in God. You who have been following Jesus for decades, you who are just beginning your journey, you who have left and have come back, I pray that you and I, all of us, would find our rest in God, because His yoke is easy and His burden is light. Jesus' words to us this morning, come to me, all you who are weary and carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Amen.